Mars in the 8th house, descent into the crucible. Welcome to Mars in the 8th house in synastry. In this overlay, we explore what happens when one person's Mars falls into another person's 8th house, the house of shared resources, psychological depth, sexuality in its most transformative dimension, death and regeneration, hidden power, and the profound and sometimes terrifying experience of being changed by another person at the level of the soul. This is perhaps the most psychologically intense overlay in the entire Mars series, and one that operates at a depth that few other placements can match. It does not announce itself through charm or through the easy warmth of compatible temperaments. It announces itself through intensity, through a quality of pull between two people that feels less like ordinary attraction and more like gravity, less like a choice and more like an inevitability. Whatever this overlay produces, it produces at depth, and it produces it with a force that neither person is likely to emerge from unchanged. The 8th house governs the terrain of life that resists comfortable description. It is the house of what is shared at the most fundamental level, not the pleasant sharing of the 11th, which distributes affection and belonging across a social world, but the more demanding sharing of resources, of bodies, of psychological interiors, of the parts of the self that are ordinarily kept from view because they are too raw, too complex, or too threatening to be exposed to ordinary social light. It is the house of sexuality in its deepest and most psychologically loaded sense, not the joyful, erotic pleasure of the 5th, which is desire in its more luminous expression, but the sexuality that involves genuine vulnerability, genuine surrender, genuine encounter with the other person at a level that is not entirely safe and is not meant to be. It is the house of death and regeneration, of the experiences that require something in us to die in order for something else to be born. And it is the house of hidden power, of the psychological dynamics that operate beneath the surface of a relationship, shaping it in ways that are not always visible to either person until the pattern is already deeply established. In traditional astrology, the 8th house has a consistently difficult reputation. It is associated with death, with loss, with the resources of others, with what is owed and what is taken. It is a succedent house, which gives it a quality of building and accumulating. But what it builds and accumulates is not the pleasant material security of the 2nd house. It is psychological complexity, transformative pressure, and the slow accretion of power dynamics that define the deeper architecture of intimate relationships. Traditional sources often treated the 8th house as genuinely malefic terrain, a house whose associations were with the endings and losses that human beings find most difficult to metabolize. Mars, itself a malefic, entering this house through another person's chart, is therefore a significant configuration. Two forces that each carry real potential for difficulty, meeting in the domain of life where difficulty, when it arrives, tends to arrive at its most essential and most transformative. From the Mars person's perspective, the house person is compelling in a way that operates below the level of ordinary conscious attraction. There is something about the house person that pulls at the Mars person with a force that is not easily explained or easily dismissed, a quality of depth, of psychological complexity, of hidden interior life that the Mars person finds irresistible in a way that has as much to do with appetite for discovery as with simple desire. The Mars person is drawn to penetrate the house person's depths, not merely physically, though the physical dimension of this overlay is almost always pronounced, but psychologically. They want to know what the house person keeps hidden. They want access to the interior rooms that the house person does not ordinarily open. There is a compulsive quality to this drive in some cases, a need to go deeper, to push further, to find whatever lies beneath the surface that the house person presents to the world. The Mars person may also find themselves activated in ways they did not anticipate by the house person's 8th house terrain. The 8th house is not a passive environment. It has its own power, its own psychological gravity, its own capacity to draw out from the Mars person material that the Mars person did not necessarily know was there. Old wounds, buried angers, unresolved power dynamics from the distant past that the intensity of the eighth house encounter brings to the surface with a force that can feel disorienting, even to the Mars person themselves. Mars in the eighth is not simply Mars acting upon the house person. It is also Mars being acted upon, being drawn into the house person's psychological depth and finding there things about itself that it did not fully know. From the house person's perspective, the Mars person's energy arrives in the most psychologically sensitive and transformatively charged domain of their experience. The initial impact of this arrival is almost always intense. The house person feels the Mars person's presence in their eighth house as a force, a genuine and undeniable pressure against the deeper layers of their psychological interior. This can be experienced, particularly in the early stages of the relationship, as profoundly and compellingly intimate. The Mars person seems to see through the house person's surfaces in a way that few others can or do, to perceive and to desire the depth and complexity that the house person has often felt they must conceal from the ordinary social world. There is a quality of being genuinely known here, of being encountered at the level of one's actual psychological reality rather than one's social presentation, that the house person may find deeply and almost overwhelmingly appealing. The sexual dimension of this overlay is significant and must be addressed with the directness it deserves. Mars in the eighth house produces a sexual dynamic of considerable intensity, not the joyful, uncomplicated erotic pleasure of the fifth, but something considerably more complex and considerably more powerful. The sexuality here involves genuine psychological exposure, the experience of being seen and of seeing the other person in a way that goes well beyond the physical. There is a transformative quality to the physical intimacy in this overlay that both people are likely to feel. The sense that what happens between them in the most intimate dimension of the relationship is changing them in ways that extend far beyond the physical encounter itself. This can be among the most profound sexual experiences either person has. It can also be among the most destabilizing, because the eighth house does not permit the comfortable separation of the physical from the psychological, and Mars here ensures that the intensity is always, in some sense, more than either person fully bargained for. At its most constructive, Mars in the eighth house creates a relationship of genuine psychological depth and transformative intimacy, one in which both people are changed, in real and lasting ways, by the encounter. The Mars person's energy penetrates the house person's psychological defenses in ways that, when the dynamic is healthy, are genuinely liberating, helping the house person access and integrate parts of their psychological interior that have been hidden, suppressed, or unexamined. The house person's eighth house depth gives the Mars person's energy the most significant and substantive terrain it will ever encounter, a psychological complexity and richness that is genuinely worthy of Mars's considerable force and that gives the Mars person's drive a direction of real consequence. There is something in this overlay at its best that resembles the experience of genuine psychological alchemy, the transformation of both people through the sustained intensity of their encounter with each other. This overlay also produces a relationship with real psychological honesty, not the verbal directness of the third house, but a deeper and less comfortable honesty about power, desire, fear, and the hidden architecture of the self. Mars in the eighth does not permit comfortable psychological fiction to persist for long. It presses against the false self with a force that the false self cannot ultimately sustain. What emerges from that pressure, when both people have the capacity and the courage to work with it, is a relationship of unusual authenticity, one in which both people have been stripped of at least some of their ordinary psychological armor and have found that what lies beneath is not diminished by the exposure, but, in some essential way, more genuinely itself. The shadow dimension of this overlay is where its most serious and potentially most damaging dimensions must be named, because Mars in the 8th house, when it operates without awareness or care, is one of the more psychologically dangerous configurations in synastry. The 8th house is the domain of hidden power, of the psychological dynamics that shape a relationship from beneath the surface, that are difficult to see clearly while one is inside them, and that can establish themselves with a thoroughness and a depth that makes them extremely difficult to dismantle once they are in place. Mars here, without sufficient self-awareness, becomes a force of psychological domination, operating in the most intimate and undefended terrain of the houseperson's interior life. The power dynamics that Mars can establish in the 8th house are worth examining with particular care. Mars is a planet of force and dominance, and the 8th house is the house of hidden power, of control exercised not through open confrontation, as in the 7th house, but through the more subtle and more penetrating mechanisms of psychological influence. Mars in the 8th house, at its most difficult, can produce a dynamic in which the Mars person's access to the house person's psychological depth is used, not always consciously, but used nonetheless, as a means of control. The Mars person knows things about the house person that no one else knows. They have been permitted into the most private and vulnerable rooms of the house person's psychological interior. That knowledge, in the hands of a Mars that is operating from its less evolved instincts, becomes leverage, a means of psychological pressure that the house person, who has opened themselves so completely, is particularly ill-equipped to resist. Psychological manipulation, emotional coercion, and the weaponization of intimate knowledge are all within the range of what this overlay can produce at its most destructive. The Mars person may use what they know of the house person's fears, wounds, and hidden vulnerabilities to maintain a psychological dominance that the house person did not consent to and cannot easily escape, because the 8th house dynamic binds people together with a psychological adhesion that is among the most difficult to dissolve in all of synastry. The very intensity that made the connection feel so profoundly significant becomes, in its difficult expression, the mechanism of a trap. The sexual dimension of this overlay also carries shadow dimensions that must be stated plainly. Mars in the 8th house, at its most destructive, can produce a sexual dynamic in which the boundaries between desire and demand become dangerously blurred, in which the house person's psychological openness in the sexual domain is treated by the Mars person not as a gift of trust, but as an entitlement, and in which the intensity that both people initially experienced as transformative becomes, for the house person, a source of genuine fear. Sexual coercion and the violation of intimate boundaries are within the range of what Mars's malefic nature can produce in the 8th house when it is operating without restraint or genuine respect for the house person's autonomy within the most intimate dimensions of the relationship. At the more extreme end of this spectrum, Mars in the 8th house can produce a relationship that is genuinely psychologically abusive, in which the house person's most essential sense of psychological selfhood is systematically undermined through the Mars person's persistent penetration and manipulation of their deepest interior. This is the 8th house version of Mars's most destructive potential, not physical violence, as in the 4th, nor verbal aggression, as in the 3rd, but a psychological violence that operates at such depth and with such intimacy that it can be extraordinarily difficult for the house person to recognize clearly while they are inside it, and extraordinarily difficult to recover from once they have left. The distinction between the transformative and the destructive expressions of this overlay rests on the question of what the Mars person does with the access they are given to the house person's psychological depth. Whether that access is held with genuine reverence for the trust it represents and used in service of the house person's psychological growth and genuine well-being, or whether it is treated as a resource to be exploited in service of the Mars person's appetite for psychological dominance. The 8th house gives Mars more intimate access to another person than almost any other placement in synastry. What Mars chooses to do with that access is the whole of the moral question this overlay poses. At its highest expression, Mars in the 8th house creates a relationship of profound psychological transformation, one of the genuinely rare connections in which both people are fundamentally changed in ways they could not have anticipated and cannot fully reverse by the depth of their encounter with each other. The Mars person brings a penetrating force and a genuine appetite for psychological truth that helps the house person access and integrate the deepest and most essential dimensions of their own interior life. The house person gives the Mars person's energy the most significant and demanding terrain it has ever been asked to navigate, a depth and complexity that requires Mars to develop in order to meet it fully, qualities that do not come naturally. Patience, genuine care, the willingness to be changed as well as to change. When balanced, Mars in the 8th house creates profound intimacy, genuine psychological transformation, intense and meaningful sexuality, and a relationship in which both people are made more fully and authentically themselves by the sustained force of their encounter with each other. When imbalanced, it produces psychological domination, the weaponization of intimate knowledge, sexual coercion, and, at its most destructive, a psychological violation so deep and so intimate that its consequences persist long after the relationship itself has ended. What this overlay ultimately asks, of both people, but of the Mars person in particular, is whether the force they are bringing into the deepest and most undefended rooms of another person's psychological interior is a force in service of genuine encounter or a force in service of conquest. The 8th house will reveal the answer. It always does. The only question is how long it takes and what the house person has had to surrender in the interval.
This was Mars in the 8th house in Synastry Overlays. Thank you for listening. Next, Mars in the 9th house.